The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight, turning the busy London streets into rivers of gray water. Most people hurried past with umbrellas or ducked into shops and cafes to wait for the storm to pass. But one figure stood perfectly, still in the downpour, as if the weather meant nothing to him at all. James Harrison had been standing at his post outside the National Gallery for the past 6 months. At 28 years old, he was younger than most of the other guards, but he carried himself with the same dignity and discipline that had made the Queen's Guard famous around the world. The red uniform, the tall black hat, the shiny boots. Everything was exactly as it should be, even as rainwater streamed down his face. People walked by without really seeing him. To most tourists and locals, he was just part of the scenery, like a statue or a building. They took photos with him, made jokes about trying to make him laugh, and went on with their lives. James had learned to block out most of it. The training had taught him how to stand still for hours, how to ignore distractions, how to focus on his duty no matter what happened around him. But today was different. Today, through the rain and the crowds of people rushing to get out of the weather, James noticed something that made his heart ache. Across the street, sitting on the steps of a closed shop, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with tangled blonde hair and clothes that were too big for her small frame. She was soaking wet, shivering in the cold rain, but she wasn't crying. She just sat there, watching the people go by, as if she was waiting for someone who might never come. James felt his chest tighten as he looked at her. Every instinct told him to go help her, to ask where her parents were, to get her somewhere warm and dry. But he couldn't move. The rules were clear. A guard never left his post, never broke character, never let personal feelings interfere with duty. He had sworn an oath to follow those rules, no matter what. The little girl looked up, and their eyes met through the rain. She didn't wave or smile like most children did when they noticed him. Instead, she just stared with big, sad eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. James felt his resolve wavering. How could he stand here doing nothing while a child was clearly in trouble? An elderly woman with a purple umbrella walked past the girl, glanced down at her, and kept walking. A businessman in an expensive suit hurried by without even noticing her. A group of teenagers laughed and pointed at James, trying to get him to react, completely unaware of the real drama happening right behind them. The girl wrapped her arms around herself, trying to get warm, but her thin clothes offered no protection against the cold rain. James could see her lips turning blue from where he stood. His hands, hidden by white gloves, clenched into fists. Every fiber of his being wanted to break protocol and help her. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The rain kept falling, and the little girl kept sitting there, alone and forgotten by everyone who passed. James began to notice more details that worried him. Her shoes were worn through in several places. Her clothes, though too big, were dirty and looked like she had been wearing them for days. Most concerning of all, she kept looking around as if searching for someone. But no adult ever came looking for her. A police officer walked by, and for a moment, James thought the situation might resolve itself. But the officer was focused on traffic, trying to help cars navigate the flooded streets, and never noticed the small figure huddled on the shop steps. James had never felt so helpless in his life. All his training, all his discipline, all his strength, none of it mattered when he couldn't help a child who clearly needed assistance. The uniform that usually made him feel proud now felt like a prison. The girl looked up at him again, and this time she did something that nearly broke his heart. She smiled. It was a small, sad smile, but it was meant for him. She had noticed that he was the only person who seemed to see her, the only one who looked at her with concern instead of indifference. In that moment, James realized that his presence, even from across the street, was providing her with some small comfort. But comfort wasn't enough. The rain was getting harder, and the temperature was dropping. James could see that the girl was starting to show signs of being dangerously cold. Her shivering had become more violent, and she was having trouble keeping her head up. As his second hour of watching her began, James made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He began to think of ways he might be able to help without completely abandoning his post. Could he signal to someone? Could he somehow get attention without speaking or moving from his position? Then he saw her start to stand up, swaying slightly. As if she was dizzy, she looked around one more time, as if hoping that whoever she was waiting for might finally appear. When no one came, she began to walk away, her small figure disappearing into the crowd of people with umbrellas and raincoats. James felt panic rise in his chest. If she walked away now, he might never see her again. And from the way she had been. Sitting there, cold and alone for so long, he was certain she was in real danger. This wasn't just a child who had wandered away from her parents for a few minutes. This was someone who had nowhere to go and no one to take care of her. The moment stretched out like an eternity. James could hear his sergeant's voice from training, talking about duty and discipline and the importance of never breaking protocol. He could imagine the consequences he would face if he left his post. But louder than any of those voices was his conscience, telling him that some things were more important than rules. The little girl was almost out of sight now, just a small figure disappearing into the gray rain. In a few more seconds, she would be gone forever, and James would have to live with the knowledge that he had chosen duty over compassion, protocol over humanity. That was when James Harrison, Queen's Guard, made the most important decision of his life. James broke every rule he had ever been taught in that single moment. His feet, which had been perfectly positioned for over 2 hours, moved first. Then his whole body followed, marching across the wet street with the same precision he had always used, but now with a completely different purpose. The tourists and locals stopped and stared. Some laughed, thinking it was part of some special ceremony. Others pulled out their phones to record what they assumed was an unusual performance, but James didn't care about any of them. His focus was entirely on the small figure ahead of him, getting smaller as she walked further away. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying over the sound of the rain. It was the first word he had spoken while on duty in 6 months, and it felt strange coming from his lips. "Please wait." The little girl turned around, her eyes wide with surprise. She had probably never expected the still, silent guard to suddenly come to life and follow her. For a moment she looked scared, as if she might run away. James slowed down as he got closer, not wanting to frighten her more than he already had. He knelt down on the wet pavement so he would be at her eye level, not caring that his uniform was getting soaked and dirty. "Hello," he said gently. "My name is James. What's yours?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he could barely hear her over the rain. "Charlotte," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name," James said, trying to keep his voice calm and friendly. "Charlotte, where are your parents? Are they looking for you?" Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she shook her head slowly. "Mama went away," she said. "She said she would come back, but that was a long time ago." James felt his heart break a little more. "How long ago, Charlotte?" "I don't know," she said, looking down at her wet shoes. "Maybe 4 days, maybe more. I can't remember. 4 days." This little girl had been alone on the streets of London for 4 days, and somehow no one had helped her. James couldn't understand how that was possible, but looking at her now, he realized that she was the kind of child who might easily become invisible. She was quiet, small, and had probably learned to hide when adults came near. "Hungry?" James asked, though he could see the answer in her thin face and the way her clothes hung loose on her small body. Charlotte nodded, then quickly added, "I found some bread yesterday in a bin behind the bakery. It was still good." The thought of this child eating garbage made James feel sick. He looked around and saw that a crowd was starting to gather. People were pointing and whispering, and he knew that soon his commanding officers would hear about what he had done. But that didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was making sure Charlotte was safe. "Charlotte," he said, "I want to help you. But first, I need to take you somewhere warm and dry. Will you come with me?" She looked at him carefully, studying his face as if trying to read his intentions. "Are you really a guard?" she asked. "The kind that protects the Queen?" "Yes, I am, James replied. And right now I want to protect you too. Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she nodded and took a small step closer to him. After a moment of hesitation, Charlotte took it. As they walked back toward the National Gallery, James could hear people in the crowd talking about them. Some were taking pictures, others were calling out questions, but James ignored all of it. He had made his choice, and he wasn't going to let public attention change his mind. But as they got closer to his post, James saw something that made his stomach drop. His commanding officer, Sergeant Williams, was standing exactly where James should have been. The older man's face was red with anger, and James knew he was in serious trouble. "Harrison," Sergeant Williams shouted as soon as he saw them approaching. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" James felt Charlotte's hand tighten in his. She pressed closer to his side, clearly frightened by the angry man's voice. James put his other hand on her shoulder protectively. "Sir, I can explain," James began, but the sergeant cut him off. "You left your post. You abandoned your duty. Do you have any idea what the consequences of this will be?" "Sergeant Williams's..." The voice was getting louder. More people were gathering to watch the confrontation. Charlotte looked up at James with worried eyes. "Are you in trouble because of me?" she whispered. Before James could answer, something unexpected happened. A woman in the crowd stepped forward. She was middle-aged, with gray hair and kind eyes, and she was looking directly at Charlotte with an expression of concern. "Excuse me," she said to Sergeant Williams, "but this child is clearly in distress." This young man did the right thing. "Ma'am, this is a military matter," the sergeant replied stiffly. "I ask that you please step back." But the woman didn't move. Instead, she knelt down next to Charlotte, just as James had done. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Charlotte shook her head. But James could see that. She was starting to cry now. The stress of the last few days, combined with all the attention and loud voices, was finally overwhelming her. More people in the crowd began to speak up. James heard voices saying things like he did the right thing, and someone needed to help that child, and you should be proud of him, not angry. Sergeant Williams looked around at the growing crowd, clearly realizing that the situation was becoming more complicated than a simple case of a guard abandoning his post. The people watching weren't just curious tourists anymore. They were becoming emotionally invested in what happened to Charlotte. James looked down at the little girl clinging to his side, then up at his angry commanding officer, then out at the crowd of strangers who were unexpectedly taking his side. He realized that in the next few minutes, everything about his life was going to change. But as he felt Charlotte's small hand in his, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. The rain continued to fall, but somehow it didn't seem as cold anymore. The crowd was growing bigger by the minute, and James could see people pulling out their phones to record what was happening. He knew that by evening, videos of this moment would be all over social media. But right now, his main concern was Charlotte, who was shivering even more violently than before. The kind woman who had knelt down beside Charlotte stood up and faced Sergeant Williams. "This child needs immediate help," she said firmly. "She's cold, hungry, and appears to have been on her own for days. Whatever disciplinary action you need to take can wait until she's been taken care of." James was grateful for her support, but he could see that his sergeant was not impressed. Military protocol was everything to Sergeant Williams, and James had broken the most fundamental rule of all. "Harrison, you will return to your post immediately," the sergeant ordered. "We will deal with this situation through proper channels." James didn't move. "Sir, with respect, I can't leave her. She's been alone for 4 days. She needs help now, not after we filled out paperwork." The tension between the two men was obvious to everyone watching. James had never disobeyed a direct order before. Sergeant Williams had never had a guard openly refuse his commands in front of civilians. Charlotte looked up at James with tears in her eyes. "I don't want you to get in trouble," she whispered. "I can go back to waiting by myself." The innocence in her voice broke something inside. James, this little girl was more worried about him getting in trouble than she was about her own desperate situation. It made his decision even clearer. "No, Charlotte," he said gently. "You're not going back to waiting by yourself. We're going to find you help, and we're going to make sure you're safe." A man in the crowd called out, "Good for you, mate." Someone needed to help her. Earth began clapping and shouting their agreement. The public support seemed to surprise Sergeant Williams, who was clearly not used to dealing with civilian opinions about military matters. Then something happened that changed everything. An elderly gentleman pushed through the crowd, and James recognized him immediately. It was Colonel Peters, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Queen's Guard, a man whose opinion could make or break any soldier's career. Everyone fell silent as the colonel approached. He looked at Charlotte, then at James, then at Sergeant. Williams's expression was unreadable, and James felt his heart pounding as he waited to hear what the colonel would say. "Sergeant Williams," the colonel said in his crisp, authoritative voice, "what exactly is the situation here?" "Sir, Private Harrison abandoned his post to pursue a civilian matter. He has refused direct orders to return to his position," the sergeant replied formally. Colonel Peters nodded slowly, then knelt down in front of Charlotte. Despite his age and formal uniform, he spoke to her with the same gentleness that James had shown. "Hello, young lady. I'm Colonel Peters. Can you tell me your name?" "Charlotte," she said quietly, still holding on to James's hand. "Charlotte, can you tell me where you've been staying? Do you have family in London?" Charlotte shook her head. "Ma brought me here from up north. She said we were going to start a new life. But then she got sick, and the men came and took her away. She told me to wait for her, but she never came back." The colonel's expression grew more serious. "How long have you been waiting, Charlotte?" "For days, I think. Maybe 5. I'm not sure." Colonel Peters stood up and looked at the crowd, then at James, then at Sergeant Williams. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly over the sound of the rain. "Private Harrison," he said, "you abandoned your post without permission?" James felt his stomach drop. He had expected this, but hearing it from Colonel Peters made it feel final. "Yes, sir," James replied. "You disobeyed direct orders from your commanding officer." "Yes, sir." "You broke protocol in front of civilians and created a public disturbance." "Yes, sir." The colonel paused for a long moment, and James prepared himself for the worst. Court-martial, discharge. The end of his military career, all of it was possible. But then, Colonel Peters surprised everyone. "You also," he said, "demonstrated the highest values of the Queen's Guard: courage, compassion, and the willingness to put the welfare of others before your own interests." The crowd murmured with approval, and James looked up in shock. "The Queen's Guard exists to protect and serve," the colonel continued. "Today, Private Harrison has done exactly that. He saw someone in need and took action, even knowing it would cost him personally." Sergeant Williams looked as surprised as James felt. "Sir, he still broke protocol." Sergeant Colonel Peters interrupted. "There are times when doing the right thing is more important than following rules. This is one of those times." The colonel turned to address the crowd. "This young man has shown us what it truly means to serve. He didn't just guard a building or follow orders blindly. He saw a child in danger and chose to act with courage and compassion." The crowd began clapping, and James heard someone shout, "Hero." But he didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like someone who had done what anyone should do when they see a child in trouble. Charlotte tugged on his sleeve. "Does this mean you're not in trouble?" she asked hopefully. James looked down at her and smiled for the first time all day. "I think it means we're both going to be okay." But even as he said it, James knew that Charlotte's problems were far from over. She still had no family, no home, and no one to take care of her. The immediate crisis of getting her out of the rain was solved. But the bigger questions about her future remained unanswered. As if reading his thoughts, the kind woman who had first spoken up stepped forward again. "What happens to her now?" she asked Colonel Peters. "She can't go back to living on the streets." The colonel nodded gravely. "Social services will need to be contacted. There are procedures that must be followed to ensure her safety and find her proper care." James felt Charlotte's hand squeeze his more tightly. She was smart enough to understand that proper care might mean being taken away from the one person who had shown her kindness in days. "Will I see you again?" she asked James quietly, before he could answer. Something else unexpected happened that would change both of their lives in ways they never could have imagined. A news reporter had arrived at the scene. Drawn by the crowd and the unusual sight of a Queen's Guard kneeling in the rain with a small child, Sarah Mitchell from BBC London News pushed through the gathering people with her cameraman close behind. "Excuse me," she called out to Colonel Peters. "I'm Sarah Mitchell from BBC News. Can you tell us what's happening here?" James instinctively stepped in front of Charlotte, trying to shield her from the camera. The last thing she needed was to have her face broadcast on television while she was so vulnerable. But Sarah had sharp eyes. She quickly understood the real story. She had been a journalist for 15 years and had covered many human interest stories, but something about this situation immediately caught her attention. "This is quite extraordinary," she said, speaking directly to the camera while standing in the rain. "What we have here is a member of the Queen's Guard who left his post to help a child in distress. The little girl, who appears to be alone and has been surviving on the streets, was spotted by Private Harrison during his duty." Colonel Peters stepped forward. "If I may," he said to the reporter, "this is a sensitive situation involving a minor. While I appreciate the media's interest, our primary concern must be the child's welfare." Sarah nodded respectfully, but James could see that she understood the power of this story. A decorated guard abandoning his post to help a homeless child. It was exactly the kind of human interest story that would capture public attention. Meanwhile, Charlotte had grown quiet, overwhelmed by all the adult conversations happening around her. She pressed closer to James, and he could feel her trembling, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or from fear. "Charlotte," he said softly, "are you okay?" She looked up at him with those serious eyes that seemed too old for her face. "There are so many people," she whispered. "Will they take me away from you?" The question hit James like a physical blow. In his rush to help her, he hadn't fully considered what would happen next. Social services would indeed need to get involved, and there was no guarantee that Charlotte would be placed somewhere good, or that he would ever see her again. The kind woman who had been advocating for Charlotte stepped closer. "I'm Dr. Emma Walsh," she said to James quietly. "I work with children in crisis situations. May I speak with Charlotte?" James looked down at Charlotte, nodded shyly. Dr. Walsh knelt down to Charlotte's level, something James was beginning to realize was the mark of adults who truly understood how to treat children with respect. "Charlotte, can you tell me about your mama?" Dr. Walsh asked gently. "What happened when she got sick?" "She was coughing a lot," Charlotte said in her small voice. "And she got very hot, like she had a fever. Then one morning, some men in uniforms came to our room and took her to the hospital. She told me to wait for her there, but the man who owned the room said I couldn't stay if she wasn't paying rent." James felt anger rise in his chest. Someone had thrown a 7-year-old child out on the street while her mother was in the hospital. "So you've been looking for your mama?" Dr. Walsh continued. Charlotte nodded. "I went to different hospitals, but they won't tell me anything because I'm too little. I thought maybe if I waited long enough she would find me." Dr. Walsh exchanged a meaningful look with James and Colonel Peters. They were all thinking the same thing. If Charlotte's mother had been admitted to a hospital 4 days ago and hadn't come looking for her daughter, there was likely a very sad reason why. "Charlotte," Dr. Walsh said carefully, "I think we need to help you find your mama. First, we need to get you somewhere warm and safe. Would that be okay?" Before Charlotte could answer, Sarah, the news reporter, spoke up. "Dr. Walsh, if I may, I think the public would be very interested in helping this little girl. Sometimes when stories like this are shared, wonderful things can happen." James was torn. Part of him wanted to protect Charlotte's privacy, but another part of him realized that public attention might actually help her situation. If people knew about her story, perhaps someone who knew about her mother might come forward. Her resources might become available to help her. "What do you think, Charlotte?" James asked. "Would you be okay if this nice lady told people about what happened? She thinks it might help us find your mama." Charlotte considered this seriously, the way children do when adults treat their opinions. "As important, will you stay with me?" she asked James. "I'll stay as long as I'm allowed to," James promised, though he had no idea if that would be possible. Colonel Peters stepped forward. "Private Harrison, given the extraordinary circumstances, I'm granting you temporary leave to assist with this situation. Your actions today have reflected great credit on the Queen's Guard, and I believe your continued involvement would be beneficial for everyone concerned." James felt a wave of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, sir." Sarah positioned herself where she could speak to the camera while including James and Charlotte in the background, though she was careful not to show Charlotte's face clearly. "This is a remarkable story of compassion and duty," she began. Private. James Harrison of the Queen's Guard noticed 7-year-old Charlotte, who has been surviving on London's streets for days while searching for her mother, who was taken to hospital. Despite strict protocols that require guards to remain at their posts, Private Harrison made the difficult choice to leave his position to help a child in desperate need. As Sarah continued her report, describing the situation and asking anyone with information about Charlotte's mother to contact authorities, something magical began to happen. People in the crowd started pulling out their phones, not just to record, but to share the story on social media. Within minutes, the hashtag Charlotte and the Guard was starting to trend on Twitter. People were sharing the news report, adding their own messages of support, and spreading Charlotte's story across the internet. James watched this unfold with amazement. He had simply seen a child who needed help and acted on instinct. He never could have imagined that his decision would capture so much attention. But Charlotte was getting tired. The excitement and stress of the day, combined with days of poor sleep and little food, were catching up with her. She swayed slightly where she stood, and James immediately scooped her up in his arms. "We need to get her medical attention," Dr. Walsh said urgently, "and food and rest." As they prepared to leave for the hospital, James looked back at his post, where another guard had taken his place, thought about his normal routine, standing still for hours, ignoring the tourists, going home alone to his small apartment. Now, carrying this small girl who had trusted him enough to take his hand, James realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to understand. And somehow, despite all the uncertainty ahead, that felt exactly right. At the hospital, Charlotte was given a thorough medical examination, while James waited anxiously outside. Dr. Walsh had accompanied them and was working with social services to ensure Charlotte received proper care. The news story had aired just 2 hours ago, but already the hospital was receiving calls from people wanting to help. When the doctor finally emerged from Charlotte's room, her expression was serious but not alarming. "She's malnourished and dehydrated, but nothing that can't be fixed with proper care," she told James. "Physically, she's going to be fine. Emotionally, though, she's been through a terrible ordeal for someone so young." James felt relief wash over him. "Can I see her? She's been asking for you," the doctor smiled. "I think you've become quite important to her." Inside the hospital room, Charlotte looked small and fragile in the big bed, but she was clean now and wearing a hospital gown that actually fit her. When she saw James, her face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "James, the nurses gave me soup, and it was warm, and there was bread too," she said excitedly. "And they said I can have more if I'm still hungry." Down in the chair beside her bed, "I'm so glad you're feeling better. The doctor says you're going to be okay." Charlotte's expression grew more serious. "Have they found Mama yet?" Before James could answer, Dr. Walsh entered the room with a social worker named Mrs. Patterson. Both women looked like they had difficult news to share. "Charlotte," Dr. Walsh said gently, "we've been looking for your mama, and we found some information." Charlotte sat up straighter in her bed, hope and fear mixing in her eyes. "Your mama's name is Linda Chen, and she was admitted to St. Mary's Hospital 4 days ago with pneumonia," Mrs. Patterson explained carefully. "She's been very sick, Charlotte, but the good news is that she's getting better." Charlotte's face broke into a smile. "Can I see her? Can we go now?" Dr. Walsh and Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances. "There's something else we need to tell you, sweetheart. When your mama got sick, she was very worried about you. She told the hospital staff about you, and they've been looking for you too." James felt his heart racing. If Charlotte's mother had told the hospital about her, why hadn't they found her sooner? "The problem," Mrs. Patterson continued, "was that your mama was so sick she couldn't remember exactly where she had left you. She knew it was somewhere near the big galleries in London, but she couldn't give them the specific location. She's been crying about you every day, Dr. Walsh added. She's been so worried that something terrible had happened to you. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. She was looking for me too? She didn't forget about me? Oh, honey, no, Mrs. Patterson said, sitting on the edge of the bed. She never forgot about you. She loves you very much. In fact, when the hospital told her we'd found you, she tried to get out of bed to come here, even though she's still very weak. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. This whole time, while Charlotte had been waiting and hoping, her mother had been doing the same thing from a hospital bed across the city. When can I see her? Charlotte asked. How about right now? Dr. Walsh said with a smile. We've arranged for you to be transferred to her hospital. She's well enough for visitors, and I think seeing you will help her get better even faster. As the nurses prepared Charlotte for transport, James realized that his part in this story was probably coming to an end. Charlotte would be reunited with her mother, and they would begin rebuilding their lives together. He would go back to his duties as a guard, and eventually, this extraordinary day would become just a memory. But Charlotte had other ideas. James, she said as they wheeled her bed toward the elevator, will you come with me to see Mama? I want her to meet you. James looked at Dr. Walsh, who nodded encouragingly. I think that would be lovely, Charlotte. Your mother is going to want to thank the person who took care of you. The ride to St. Mary's Hospital was quiet. Charlotte held James's hand and stared out the window at the city streets. James wondered what she was thinking about, whether she was nervous about seeing her mother after so many days, or excited, or scared. James, she said suddenly, what if Mama is still really sick? What if she has to stay in the hospital for a long time? James squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll figure out how to make sure you're both okay. That's what people do when they care about each other. They find solutions. When they arrived at St. Mary's Hospital, they were surprised to find several reporters waiting outside. The story of Charlotte and the guard had spread across social media faster than anyone had expected, and news outlets were eager to cover the reunion. But James only cared about Charlotte. As they approached room 358, he could see through the door window a woman propped up in bed, straining to see down the hallway. When she spotted Charlotte, Linda Chen burst into tears. Mama! Charlotte cried out as the nurses wheeled her into the room. The reunion was everything James had hoped it would be. Linda Chen, despite her weakness from illness, sat up and wrapped her daughter in the tightest hug possible. Both of them were crying and laughing at the same time, and James had to wipe tears from his own eyes. I'm so sorry, baby, Linda whispered into Charlotte's hair. I'm so sorry I couldn't come back for you. Tried to tell them where you were, but I was so sick I couldn't remember properly. It's okay, Mama, Charlotte said. James found me. He took care of me. Linda looked up at James for the first time, her eyes full of gratitude. You're James? You're the guard who helped my daughter? James felt suddenly shy. Yes, ma'am.
Right.
I just did what anyone would do. No, Linda said firmly, though her voice was still weak. Not everyone would have given up their post to help a stranger's child. What you did was extraordinary. As James watched Charlotte and her mother together, he realized that seeing them reunited was worth whatever consequences he might have faced for leaving his post. Some rules were worth breaking when human lives were at stake, but the story was far from over. Outside the hospital, something was happening that would touch hearts around the world and change all their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The story of Charlotte and James had spread around the world in just 24 hours. What started as a local news report in London had become a global sensation, shared millions of times across every social media platform. Videos of James leaving his post to help Charlotte had been viewed by people in countries neither of them had ever heard of. Back at the hospital, James was sitting beside Charlotte's bed when Dr. Walsh burst through the door with excitement on her face. You need to see this, she said, pulling out her tablet. The response to Charlotte's story has been absolutely incredible. She showed them news reports from America, Australia, Germany, and Japan, all covering their story. Hashtag Charlotte and the Guard had become one of the most trending topics worldwide, with people sharing messages of support and admiration for James's actions. But more importantly, people weren't just sharing the story. They were taking action. A GoFundMe page has been set up to help Charlotte and her mother, Dr. Walsh explained. In just one day, people from around the world have donated over £50,000 to help with medical bills, housing, and getting them back on their feet. Linda Chen stared at the tablet in disbelief. Strangers did this? For us? That's not all, Dr. Walsh continued. 3 different landlords have offered you free housing for 6 months. A children's clothing company wants to send Charlotte a year's worth of clothes, and a local school has offered Charlotte a full scholarship and extra support to help her catch up on any education she might have missed. Charlotte looked confused by all the numbers and offers, but she understood that people were being kind to her and her mama. She asked. James smiled at her, because your story reminded them of something important. It reminded them that we're supposed to take care of each other. As the days passed, the kindness continued to pour in. Letters arrived from children around the world, sending Charlotte drawings and messages of friendship. Adults wrote to James, thanking him for showing that doing the right thing still mattered. Even when it was difficult, one letter particularly moved. It was from a young soldier stationed overseas who wrote, "Seeing you choose compassion. Over protocol reminded me why I joined the military in the first place, to protect and serve others, especially those who can't protect themselves." Charlotte's mother recovered quickly, helped by the knowledge that her daughter was safe and by the overwhelming support they were receiving. But more than the money or gifts, it was the messages of love from strangers that helped heal the trauma of their difficult few weeks. 3 months later, Charlotte and Linda had moved into a small but comfortable apartment donated by a local family who had been moved by their story. Charlotte was enrolled in school and thriving, making friends and catching up on her studies with the help of volunteers who had offered their time for free. James had been officially commended for his actions and was now involved in a new community outreach program that connected the Queen's Guard with local charities helping vulnerable children. His commanding officers had realized that his actions, while technically against regulations, had shown the world what military service truly meant. But the most important change was in the relationships that had formed. James had become like family to Charlotte and Linda. Every Sunday, he would come for lunch at their apartment, and Charlotte would tell him about her week at school, her new friends, and the books she was reading. James, Charlotte said one Sunday afternoon, as they walked through the park near her new home, "Do you remember when I was sitting in the rain and you were standing across the street?" "I remember," James replied. "I wasn't really waiting for Mama anymore," Charlotte admitted quietly. "I knew something bad had happened to her. I was just sitting there because I didn't know what else to do." James felt his heart ache for what she had been through. "But then I saw you looking at me," she continued, "and even though you couldn't move or talk, I could tell you cared. You were the first person in days who really saw me." "You were very brave, Charlotte," James said. "Braver than you should have had to be." "You were brave too," she replied. "You gave up your job to help me?" James smiled. "I didn't give up my job. I just remembered what my job really was." As they walked home, James reflected on how much his life had changed. Before that rainy day, he had been proud of his ability to stand still and ignore distractions. Now he understood that the most important moments in life were often the ones that required movement, action, and the courage to break rules when human hearts were at stake. The story of Charlotte and the Guard had touched millions of people because it reminded them of a simple truth, that in a world full of noise and distraction, the most powerful thing anyone can do is simply notice when someone needs help and then choose to act. Years later, when Charlotte was grown up and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of the day a Queen's Guard left his post to save her life. She would explain how one person's willingness to see her, really see her, and she was invisible to everyone else, had changed everything. And she would teach them that sometimes the most important rule to follow is the one written not in any manual or regulation, but in the human heart, that we are all responsible for taking care of each other, especially those who cannot take care of themselves. The rain had stopped falling long ago. But the warmth that James and Charlotte had brought to the world's heart continued to spread, inspiring others to choose compassion over indifference, action over apathy, and love over fear. Through the rain he had stood proud and still, but when It mattered most. James had chosen to move. And in doing so, he had shown the world that true strength isn't found in remaining unmoved, but in being moved by what matters most.